Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Brian O'Keefe, and I'm with the Santa Fe chapter of Amnesty International, Group 122. We, along with the College of Santa Fe, are sponsoring tonight's event, and I want to thank the college for their generous assistance, especially Brother Brian and Melanie Moore. We are fortunate to have with us tonight some renowned experts on our topic, the occupied Palestinian territories, including our main speaker, Anna Baltzer, as well as Santa Fe's own Mary Charlotte DeMondi from KSFR Radio as our moderator for the panel and question and answer following Anna's presentation. Before I go into an introduction of our topic, I'd first like to tell you a little bit about our local group. We're a small group, though larger than many of the AI groups nationally, and our work is entirely volunteer with the main focus on human rights and the protection of them. To that end, we petition governments, foreign as well as our own, in an effort to try to ensure that everyone is accorded the rights due to them by local, national, and international law. We write letters and postcards, we bring films and presenters to our town, and generally try to raise awareness of the issues of the day. In the lobby, you'll find Anna's book and DVD for sale, as well as action items and information from our group that you can use to make a case for victims of human rights abuses, in this case specifically in the occupied territories. Our groups and Anna's efforts operate solely upon donations, so we will be passing the hat a little later. And I know that many of you gave donations on the way in, and those are very gratefully accepted. Anything else you can give, or those who did not, possibly reconsider. Donating to AI is one way that your voice can be magnified in supporting the rights of all to dignity and justice. While preparing my introduction for tonight, I thought of many of the protest songs that I learned and played over the years. Songs by Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, up to Bruce Springsteen and even the Dixie Chicks. Titles like Turn, 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 All Along the Watchtower, and I'm Not Ready to Make Nice, if you remember that one from the Dixie Chicks. Many others that I never learned to play by punkers and rappers, but still important songs of resistance. But I think the best is Jimmy Cliff's 1955, Many Rivers to Cross. And while not a protest song, except on a personal level for him, the lyrics hit home. He wrote, "Many rivers to cross, and I can't seem to find my way over. Wandering I am lost as I travel along the white cliffs of Dover," or perhaps the bank of the Jordan. "Many rivers to cross, and it's only my will that's helped me survive. I've been licked, washed up for years, and it's only my pride that keeps me alive." Some may wonder why AI, as well as Anna and others, have taken up the cause of Palestinians, when so many other tragic cases of human rights abuses exist in places like Darfur, Tibet, Burma, Iraq, Iran, or the Congo, where almost 4 million people have died since 1998 in their continuing civil war. The list is unfortunately extensive, but suffice it to say that AI does apply the same efforts in investigation and reporting into abuses throughout the world, regardless of the politics, calling on all parties and governments to respect international law, while other groups such as the Women's Peace Movement, with whom Anna works, and various other individuals target specific regions and countries. Palestine, a word that has multiple meanings across several facets of the human experience. It may mean a geographical region to some. It might invoke a vision of the Holy Land with history stretching back to the dawn of civilization, or possibly pastoral images with groves of olive and apricot trees and flocks tended by people close to the land. Today, unfortunately, it brings to mind a land racked with strife, blood, and tears, with a seemingly unsolvable Gordian knot of problems and a never-ending tale of grief. What makes this area and its problems unique is part and parcel to solving some of those same issues. This Massachusetts-sized region is the forge and anvil of world events today, and the outcome there will affect us globally. For better or worse, the United States has deemed it important, indeed critical, to support Israel predominantly militarily, while at the same time similarly arming some of Israel's former proclaimed enemies. Combined with our stirring of these hornets' nests in Iran, Iraq, and the various stands, one could almost conclude that some of our leaders believe an unstable Middle East is in the best interest of the United States, or perhaps their own, and therefore outcomes must be manipulated. But surely that's a stretch of the imagination. Given that the Palestinians have vowed to never give up their quest for freedom or the right to return to the homes they lost during the birth of the nation of Israel, as well as Israel's determination to have or expand the Jewish state within secure borders, the outcome seems deadlocked, with no equitable solution in the foreseeable future. Is it possible the Palestinians face the specter of virtual eradication, much as the Native Americans experienced in this country, thus rendering the problem moot and academic? Or on the other hand, will they witness and participate in the eventual creation of a democratic state, as happened in South Africa, or something in between? The future is uncertain, to say the least. AI believes the past peace plans have generally attached too little weight to fundamental human rights and the requirements of international law, and so they have invariably failed. Fundamental human rights and justice as part of short-term political considerations is not an adequate recipe for achieving durable peace, and security that ultimately rests on the backbone of human rights is the only solution to a just settlement. It's in no one's interest that the human rights of the Palestinians in the occupied territories continue to be abused. The collective punishment of any people is illegal and wrong, and never justifies punitive actions, either in the past or in the present. Such punishment is simply against the law. It's amoral and it must be resisted. Therein lies the beauty and simplicity of using human rights law as a tool in the settlement and discussion of the issue. It deals with present conditions, and its application is not predicated upon the airing of past grievances. It rather leads us to ask, are we to abide by the rule of law or not? If not, are we then willing to be branded as lawless, retreating into the more brutal world of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Use that argument the next time you're debating someone who does justify oppression in Palestine. The antagonism that human rights abuses engender and the possible further isolation of Israel in the world community can only serve to worsen the situation, escalate the rhetoric, and heighten military tensions. That is a recipe for disaster. For reasons of compassion as well as pragmatism, it is within this crucible that the seeds of peace and justice must be sown. It is a difficult task which requires people of a special resolve and fortitude in order to succeed. The courage of activists like Anna Baltzer and others cannot be overstated. They are men and women, young and old, peaceful and nonviolent advocates for the Palestinians who are attacked and threatened by far more powerful agents, and this speaks volumes for their characters, and their work humbles me. There are people like Joel Gullidge, a member of the Christian Peacemaker team, who was viciously attacked by settlers and hospitalized as he escorted Palestinian children to school in the South Hebron Hills. Tove Johansson, a 19-year-old Swedish volunteer, also escorting Palestinian children, was attacked by settlers, spit upon and struck in the face with a bottle, breaking her cheek. Baltzer, an Israeli activist group providing video cameras to Palestinians to document attacks from settlers, documented one such attack in June 2008, when a 58-year-old woman, her 70-year-old husband, and their nephew was attacked by settlers, beaten with baseball bats. The woman's cheek and arm was broken. Rachel Corey, a 24-year-old American volunteer with the International Solidarity Movement, was killed in 2003 by an Israeli bulldozer that crushed her as she acted as a human shield while trying to stop the demolition of Palestinian homes on Palestinian land. Unfortunately, there is a long list of similar acts against peaceful people attempting to uphold the law for those who cannot, and they are deplorable, but I do not bring them up to demonize the Israeli settlers, but rather to illustrate the strength and courage of the volunteers who speak and act truth to power. Anna Baltzer is a 29-year-old woman, a Fulbright scholar, author, speaker, member of the Women's Peace Movement, and a witness in Palestine who has spent the last 6 years advocating for the rights of the Palestinian people. She works an intense schedule of events and presentations to bring her message to as many as she can. She has lived with Palestinians and supported them in their struggles. She has stood with them in protest against both Israeli settlers who had driven them from their homes and the military who prevent them from returning. More about her courageous experiences, some harrowing and heartbreaking, some heartwarming, can be read on her website and in her book. In closing, I want to ask each and every one of us, what might we do to support these courageous workers who have put themselves on the line, eschewing normal lives to aid those who cannot defend themselves? By supporting AI, ANA, and other groups and individuals in our efforts to show the public the extent of the tragedy going on in our names, we just might shift the paradigm and move to a more peaceful and just world. Our voices can ring out in the din of world events, and if we manage to bring our voices and our message together in unison, we can chime like bells across the nation and the world with a message of justice, hope, healing, and freedom. At the risk of dating myself, I'd like to close with more lyrics, these from Bob Dylan, The Chimes of Freedom Flashing. Flashing for the warriors whose strength is not to fight, flashing for the refugees on the unarmed road of flight, and for each and every underdog soldier in the night, we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. Tolling for the searching ones on their speechless seeking trail, for the lonesome-hearted lovers with too personal a tale, and for each unharmful, gentle soul misplaced inside a jail, we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. Tolling for the aching ones whose wounds cannot be nursed, for the countless confused, accused, misused, strung out ones and worse, and for every hung-up person in the whole wide universe, we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. Let's ring those chimes of freedom flashing, and join me in welcoming Anna Baltzer.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience. I think we've just about worked out all of our tech issues, and I'm really happy to see everyone here. My name is Anna Baltzer, and I'm here to tell you about my experiences working with an organization called the International Women's Peace Service. It's a group based in the West Bank of the occupied Palestinian territories. Our group does two things. First of all, we're there to document human rights abuses in the area. And secondly, we're there to support Palestinian-led, nonviolent resistance to the occupation. And I'll be telling you more about this occupation as well as that resistance movement in my presentation. Before I go any further, first of all, do I sound too loud to you guys? Or okay, all right, good. It's hard to tell from up here. So before I talk about those things, a little bit about myself. I'm a Jewish American. I got into this work when I was teaching English in Turkey, and I started to travel through the Middle East during my vacations. I backpacked around Iran and Syria and Lebanon, and along my way I was taken in by families all over the place, in particular families of Palestinian refugees. And I had never knowingly interacted with a Palestinian person before. I probably couldn't have told you what a Palestinian was, where Palestine was. I really had no knowledge of these things. And it was through my friendships with these families that took me in that I began to hear for the first time in my life this completely different version of the history and present of Israel-Palestine from anything I had ever heard or learned growing up as a Jewish American. And my first reaction was disbelief. I thought, these are well-intentioned people who have been completely misled. And I sort of set out to prove them wrong, to reassure myself that I knew what I was talking about. And as soon as I began to do some research, I realized I had a lot of gaps in my knowledge and kind of didn't know who to believe anymore. Decided I'm going to go and see with my own two eyes. And that's what brought me to Palestine to discover what was happening for the first time. Before I get into the presentation, which describes what I did find, I wanted to clarify a few different categories that can be very confusing for people, and that confusion can really prevent people from moving forward on this issue. And that is to distinguish between what it means to be Jewish. I'm Jewish, what does that mean? Somebody who's Jewish is somebody either of the Jewish religion or the Jewish lineage. It's a bloodline. My mother's Jewish, her mother's Jewish, etc. And that is different from what it means to be Israeli, which is a citizenship. An Israeli is a citizen of the state of Israel. And that is different from what it means to be a Zionist. Zionism is a political ideology, a belief that supports the idea of an exclusively Jewish state in historic Palestine. So these are three separate categories: Jewish, Israeli, Zionist, and sometimes they overlap, but not always, and they are different. There are Jews who are not Israeli. Like myself, I don't have Israeli citizenship. There are Israelis who are not Jewish. About 20% of the people who do have Israeli citizenship are Palestinian. There are Jews who are anti-Zionist, who say this land should be for anybody who has been living there for generations, regardless of their religion or their ethnicity. And then there are Zionists who are not Jews, the increasingly influential Christian Zionist movement, largely based in this country, that supports this conflict, not because it's particularly pro-Jewish, but because, according to them, it fulfills biblical prophecy, bringing about the Armageddon, the return of the Messiah, etc. Again, not at all pro-Jewish, it's not too nice what happens to the Jews in Armageddon, but it is pro-Zionist. We have to keep these categories distinct. One of the dangers being that we must not confuse what Israel is doing with Judaism, because these things have nothing to do with each other. Some of the things that I'll be telling you about, occupation, oppression, these things have nothing to do with Judaism. And likewise, to speak out when we see human rights abuses, violations of international law, is not anti-Semitic. And I'm saying this in particular as a Jewish woman, knowing how much moral blackmail people are up against, non-Jewish people talking about this issue, shamed by claims of anti-Semitism, when that's absurd. Judaism has a history of fighting for social justice, and it is never anti-Semitic to speak out for anybody's rights, no matter who that person is or who the purpose. That on your in the handouts that you have there are a list of some of the facts and statistics from this presentation, as well as the sources of that information. I encourage you to go to those sources, to find other sources as long as they're credible, and to do that research. And there are also ideas for getting involved. And I just want to remind people that if this feels bad to you, learning about what's happening over there with our tax dollars, I think that's totally appropriate, but it's not enough. Palestinians really don't need anybody else feeling sorry for them. They have a whole lot of sympathy, and they've had it for a long time. They don't really want it. They need your help to change the situation. And so I do want to encourage everyone who was moved by this and who feels that they don't want this to be happening. Really, we have a lot of power as Americans, and I want to encourage people to use that, either by joining one of the local groups that are very active on this issue. It's great that you have that here. A lot of places I go don't have that kind of setup. So to really get involved rather than simply feeling bad about what's happening. I also want to, I want to mention what's on the back on my table there. One of them is my book, Witness in Palestine, a Jewish American woman in the occupied territories. It's full of a lot of photos and stories and maps and all kinds of good stuff. Anyways, $29 at Barnes & Noble, but I'm selling it tonight for $15 to $20, sliding scale. So if you want to get a copy, get it tonight, and I'll be happy to sign it for you. My talks have been selling so many books that I'm going to run out, I have a feeling, tonight. But never fear, I have envelopes, magic envelopes, where if you put your name on here and your address, magically in a week, one of these books will be mailed to you. And if you would like me to dedicate it to you or to anyone, Just write on the white thing on the other side here to whoever it is you'd like me to make it to, and I will personally sign each and every one of them. As soon as I get home next week, put them in the mail. So I'm sorry about that. It's good news that I sold out, but I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I also have DVDs of my presentation if there's anyone you wished had been here tonight, or if you want to see it minus the tech difficulties. Or if you want to show it to a classroom, a church, neighborhood association, whatever it might be, they're $10, and it's a video of me giving a talk. If I run out of these, I have a sign-up sheet as well. And then finally, there's a CD, a music CD, and the first song is the song that you just heard being sung, and the other 15 songs are songs sung by North American women, songs about freedom and struggle. It's $15 and a full benefit for the Palestinian girls group that Shams and Maisa are from, that works on girls' empowerment within that liberation struggle. So $15, all of which goes to the girls. And I'm going to pass around an email list. You don't have to sign it, but if you do, please print clearly if you want to get reports when I'm in Palestine.
Bill and Kathy Christensen are former CIA analysts with more than 40 years of experience. They've visited the Middle East and have written many books and articles on the subject. We're delighted to have them here. And Joe Mowry is a local anti-war activist and proponent for Palestinian rights, has written on the subject and has visited the occupied territories a couple of times, and he is co-coordinator of the Iraq-Afghanistan Memorial Installation. And each of them is going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. Do you want to go first, Bill?
Sure. Can you all hear me back there?
Yeah,
I'm
is Anna going to
I
come
am.
here?
Where is she?
Well, Anna, where's Anna?
I'm over here.
Anna,
You're-
thank you
you
so
here?
much.
You need to be over here.
I was planning to.
Sad to say, so much of what Anna had to say, I have seen personally and frankly agreed with. Yeah, I spent years in Lebanon. Yeah, I was there in 1982 when the Israeli army came north and my own apartment got shelled, courtesy of General Sharon. So I don't have the fondest memories of him. But I think it's useful to remember that the argument between the Israelis and the Palestinians is probably one of the oldest in the world and is the most explosive and the most divisive. Yeah, and sometimes I think to really understand this, you have to go back to Genesis, and Abraham and Ishmael. Remember the opening line of Moby Dick? Call me Ishmael. And Ishmael, of course, is the ancestor of all Arabs, and Isaac of Jews. So it's in a sense, the philosophy here goes back a long time. I have to keep these remarks brief. What I will say, despite how dispiriting much of what Anna has to talk about is true, and I have seen it myself. The conditions for an agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis oddly are better now than they were years ago. When I lived in the Middle East, both in Israel and in Lebanon, nobody ever talked about an independent Palestine. That was a no-no. That was not going to happen. Even when Anwar Sadat came and signed the peace treaty with Begin, or at least we had Camp David, Begin had no intention of recognizing Palestinian rights or a Palestinian state. Now it is commonplace to talk about the need for a safe, secure Israel and a safe, secure Palestine. How we get there is the matter of dispute. But we have taken an enormous jump, despite the often contemptuous occupation of the Palestinian territories by the Israeli Defense Force. We are at a point where very few people dispute that there must be an independent Palestine. And I think one of the things that Sharon, who now still lies in a coma, by the way, one of the things he as a right-winger now recognizes is that demography is everything. There are about, what I think, Anna, 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. 6 million, almost 7 million Israelis, of whom 1 million are Arabs. The sheer birth rate will tell you that within a few years there will be more Arabs than Jews in Israel and the occupied territories. Israel has a choice. Either it continues to occupy the territory, in which case you have apartheid, which is disagreeable for them, or we have one state in which, in fact, Israel ceases to be a Jewish state. And the whole point of Israel is to be a home for the Jews. That's the purpose of the state of Israel. It cannot go on this way and survive as a state. That's why you have the Kadima party, and we now have this new leadership battle going on. But that is why, in fact, at this point, demographics has become everything. Either, in fact, there are two states, one of which becomes one hopes, an independent and safe and democratic Palestine, and an independent, safe, and democratic Israel, or we begin the inexorable march towards one state, in which will either have to be apartheid or it will cease to be a Jewish state.
Wow.
Is that 5 minutes? I think so.
I think that was less than 5 minutes. That's pretty good. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Anna. I think we all have to honor Anna. She's an amazing person, and the work she's done for human rights and justice in Palestine. Bill and I, as many of you know, have also been there. I don't think we've done as courageous things as Anna has, but we've been there 6 times in the last 5.5 years. And everything Anna said about the situation, we would confirm in spades. The human rights situation is just terrible. And we've observed in our multiple trips that it's getting worse. It gets worse every year.
Can you speak up?
Speak up, yes, I know. There's something lying here that may be a microphone.
That's for the camera and
Oh,
doesn't
okay.
help anyone out there,
Okay, good,
unfortunately.
okay. Yell at me if I'm not speaking loudly enough. What I'd like to say is just a few words in anticipation of what is often criticism of presentations like this. The idea being that you cannot have a balanced presentation unless you present both sides of this conflict. But I think that there is no balance between one all-powerful party and another party that is virtually powerless. There is no balance between an oppressor and occupier on the one hand and an oppressed and occupied population on the other hand. Richard Falk, who's a well-known international law professor, and at the moment is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, was interviewed recently, very recently, and addressed just this question. He said, he was asked how you can be balanced if you only criticize the Israelis for human rights violations, and he said it is being objective to report the facts as they are and then to interpret them from the perspective of international humanitarian law. If these facts point to the persistent violation of international rules, then their legal interpretation is bound to be one-sided and critical of the violator. It's diversionary to dismiss a critical account of contested behavior because it is not balanced, quote unquote. If the reality is unbalanced, so must its assessment be, unquote. And I think there's another falsehood is the myth of neutrality. The notion that was common, for instance, in the Clinton administration and in administrations before that the U.S. role in negotiations is to be a neutral mediator and not to take a position on any of the issues. But in fact, there is no neutral ground between an occupier and the occupied, or between an oppressor and the oppressed. More importantly, neutrality only perpetuates the status quo and strengthens the strong party. A Christian theologian named Miroslav Volf, who is a professor of theology at Yale, has written quite a bit on the issue and what he sees as the problems of neutrality. He said, has written, quote, "Neutrality is positively harmful. For one, it gives tacit support to the stronger party, independently of whether that party is right or wrong. Second, neutrality shields the perpetrators and frees their hands precisely by the failure to name them as perpetrators. There's another sense in which no neutrality is possible." This is still Miroslav Volf speaking. "An initial suspicion against the perspective of the powerful is necessary, not because the powerless are innocent, but because the powerful have the means to impose their own perspective by argument and propaganda, and to support the imposition of both with the might of their weaponry. Often the only recourse of the powerless is the power of their desperate cry," unquote. This is a conflict, this particular conflict, in which it is impossible, I think, for moral people to be neutral, for moral people to be balanced, for moral people to be even-handed. Moral people cannot be other than critical of Israel's behavior and conduct, of its unspeakable human rights violations against Palestinians, of its violation of international standards of humanitarian conduct. Ironically, these are standards that were established in the aftermath of World War II, specifically in order to prevent a recurrence of the atrocities that were committed against Jews during the Holocaust. Thank you.
I'll try and be as brief. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to reiterate both Cassie's and my total agreement with Anna on the situation of and human rights of Palestinians. She's right on the mark, and the situation has gotten worse every one of the last 6 years that we have visited Palestine. I want to move quickly to a broader subject. The tight relationship between the Palestinian situation and all the other policies of the Israel-U.S. partnership in the Middle East and Central Asia. U.S. and Israeli policies and actions with respect to Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Kuwait, the other Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and most recently Georgia, are all tied together in a bundle of interrelated linkages, each of which affects all of the others. The right wing of Israeli politics, the neoconservatives in the U.S. who strongly support Israel, and the aging Israel lobby in the United States all have worked together, and all are still doing so, to bring about more wars, regime changes, instabilities, and fragmentation of any Arab Middle Eastern states that might ever conceivably threaten Israel. In addition, such wars and other changes would seriously discourage the Palestinians as the latter's potential allies are knocked off one by one, making it easier for Israel over time to finish off the Palestinians. That's the theory, held for a lot of years. Those of us who believe it is vital to improve human rights for the Palestinians must not only work to reverse present Israeli policies, but it's probably more important that we here in the United States work even harder to reverse U.S. policies. I'd also like to mention an important new book on this very topic by a gentleman named Stephen Snigoski, The Transparent Cabal. Just came out in the past month. The neoconservative agenda, war in the Middle East, and the national interest of Israel. A very fine book. Please get it and read it. And I'd also like to point out that I have a whole pile of copies of several excerpts from this book. A little booklet like this with half a dozen pages, each page having a quotation from this book. Anybody can have one of these who comes up and asks for one after we're done here this evening. Again, it's a very useful book, very careful analysis, and I recommend it to everybody. A final matter. As you all know, the Bush administration blames on extremist Muslims everything that happened on September 11, 2001, as well as the entire need for the war on terror. But a new article has just come out that's been written by David Ray Griffin, who is, in my opinion, the best of American writers on what really happened on 9/11. He asks the question, was America attacked by Muslims on 9/11? He gives 16 reasons 16, count them, why he believes it was not Muslims who attacked the U.S. This article is over 30 pages long. I was not able to make a bunch of copies of it, but at the end of the meeting, I'd be happy to help anyone who is interested in obtaining Griffin's article. And I want to read one little paragraph near the end of it, which is the conclusion of the Griffin article. And here's that one final concluding paragraph. All the proffered evidence that America was attacked by Muslims on 9/11, when subjected to critical scrutiny, appears to have been fabricated. If that is determined indeed to be the case, the implications would be enormous. Discovering and prosecuting the true perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks would obviously be important. The most important consequence, however, should be to reverse those attitudes and policies that have been based on the assumption that America was attacked by Muslims on 9/11. I want to repeat, to guarantee the Palestinians a decent moral degree of human rights that they deserve, both Israel and the United States must reverse all of their present major policies, including wars, present and future, that they pursue or may seek to pursue in the Middle East and Central Asia.
Along with all the other humiliations and frustrations of life in occupied Palestine, the village of Wadi Fakim, like so many other villages in Palestine, is being dispossessed by the construction and continued expansion of an illegal settlement on the hills above their village. The Jews-only colony of Beitar Illit is a city of more than 30,000 people, and it is continuing to grow. As the city was being constructed on Palestinian land, much of it confiscated from the village, more than 500 of Wadi Fakim's olive trees were destroyed. And as a byproduct of the leveling of the ridgetop to accommodate this massive new city, a huge slag heap of dirt was dumped down into the valley of Wadi Fakim. The residents had to shore up this new mountain of dirt and reroute one of the main roads through their village. But the most horrible part of this story is that when the sewage treatment plant for Beitar Illit was built, the overflow pipe from that plant was installed in the hillside over Wadi Fakim. So now, periodically, when they have problems with the sewage treatment plant in Beitar Illit, they direct the overflow of untreated sewage onto the agricultural lands of Wadi Fakim. So in this instance, the settlers are literally and deliberately defecating on their Palestinian neighbors. This, of course, is being done with the full knowledge and support of the Israeli government, as well as with the support of our government and our tax dollars. And this is only one of many similar situations which exist throughout the West Bank. Israel's settlement scheme is designed to degrade and dehumanize the Palestinian people at the same time as it steals their land. This is probably the single most powerful example I can give personally of the fruits of Zionism in Palestine. When one group within a population is empowered by a sense of exceptionalism and entitlement, it is hardly surprising that this kind of inhuman behavior would result. So when you hear a story in our corporate media about Israel being unable to find a partner in peace, keep in mind just who is occupying who and what the goals and objectives of this occupation are. And send a positive thought out to the millions of innocent Palestinian people who are bravely struggling to resist the Zionist colonization of Palestine.
Questions from the audience?
Question for Anna. You said a couple of times that you could become an Israeli citizen because you are Jewish. Considering how outspoken you are and how critical you are of the Israel state, are you really confident that they would embrace you? And the other question is, have there been periods of time or situations where you have feared for your personal safety?
All right. I always forget if I don't write when there's more than one. In terms of whether I'm confident that I would be accepted as an Israeli citizen, I'm fairly confident. If you go to, even if just going to Palestine now, if I were not to mention the fact that I'm Jewish, I would be subject to different treatment than if I mentioned the fact that I'm Jewish. And I think it's the same with regard to citizenship. There has been, as far as I know, one documented incident of Israel not accepting a Jewish person to become a citizen, and it was a serial killer. It was a pretty extreme example. So to my knowledge, I probably would be able to get that citizenship. In terms of my personal safety, I have been afraid. It's certainly a more dangerous place to be than where I live in the United States, but it's sort of humbling being there given the incredible amount of privilege that I have when I'm there. I mean, the whole idea of internationals being there is that our mere presence can be a deterrent to violence, that us intermingling in a nonviolent demonstration means it's all the less likely that soldiers are going to shoot into the crowd. So it's almost as, I put my body between a soldier and a Palestinian. He puts his gun down 9 times out of 10. So it's almost as if they're doing what they can not to hurt me because I'm white, I'm Jewish, I'm American, I have that privilege. So yes, there are dangers, but one has to be humbled by the fact that the Palestinians who don't choose to be there are in much more danger every single day of their lives. And the same sort of thing, by the way, is the case here in the United States, that as a Jewish person, I am able to tell stories. I receive some harassment, but it's the light kind, compared to the Palestinians who speak out about their own stories. So it's a similar case of privilege and one we should be aware of. And coming to a presentation about Palestine, and knowing that Palestinians indeed are the experts on this, but their voices are often not heard.
Do you have any idea about the condition in Israel, the part that's occupied just by Israelis, of what the public perception is? What percentage of Israelis are for and against? And then also, are there demonstrations going on within Israel, and is that tolerated? Because all the demonstrations you showed were in the occupied areas.
Within Israel, as I said, there's much more debate about this issue than here in this country. In fact, if you look at Israeli polls, more than 50% of the Israeli population is either extremely critical of or outright against the occupation. So things that are commonly discussed there are completely taboo here in this country. So there are a lot of Israelis who disagree with the occupation policies. Whether or not they disagree with Zionism is another story. It is a smaller group of people, but it's growing. That is to say, if that's confusing, those who not only would stop the occupation, but say, let this country be the state of its citizens rather than only one particular ethnicity and religion. Demonstrations, there are a lot of demonstrations within Israel. I would ask an Israeli, actually, because I spend most of my time within the West Bank, and I know that many occur, but I couldn't tell you what percentage of them are harassed by police, for example. But there is...
Like it was here when the civil rights movement was going on. It's not like that.
There have been Israelis shot within the occupied territories. I haven't heard of that happening. I know, for example, with Gaza, the times when the Israeli army and government have wanted to use restraint, they have been able to. With the Gaza pullout, taking the kicking and screaming settlers, rock-throwing settlers, they managed not to harm anybody. And I imagine they would take the same precautions in Israel precisely for that privilege that Israelis have over Palestinians in the occupied territories. So to my knowledge, there is relative freedom. And for me, by the way, and really there's relative freedom here in this country. And I was just this morning talking to some South Africans and Germans about how much less freedom they have had in the past to speak out than Israelis do and than us as Americans do. And that is all the more reason why we really don't have an excuse to not speak out. We are not being threatened with death threats most of the time or being attacked by the government. Usually, not always.
I was just curious, how long has Palestine existed as a state? That's one question. And then, if it's existed for for a long time, why do we have to?
Someone else can take that.
Palestinian state that already exists. And then the other is if as the person that introduced everything, if this is to the benefit, we're living in a rogue state that we live in, where you can practice preemptive war, you can practice torture, you can do all these things that supposedly we don't do, and it is our interest to keep things active over there. To what point is trying to change things when we don't obey international law anyway?
Do you want to fill the question about the Palestinian state?
Well, there never has been an independent Palestine. There has been an area called Palestine for about 2,000 years, beginning even Roman times, Palestina. But as an independent state, no, there never has been. That doesn't mean that there is not an independent or a Palestinian national identity. There is that, which competes with that of Israel for the same territory. But in terms of a state, no, there never has been.
Could I add something to that? After World War I, the British were given a mandate over Palestine, over the area of Palestine, which had previously been under the Ottoman Turks. And that was the area that is now Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and Jerusalem. And it was that, the map, the 4 maps that Anna had, that showed the constantly reduced, green area of the Palestinians, was the area that had been the British mandate, and it was the British who couldn't reconcile the difference between, the differences between the two populations that turned the problem over to the United Nations, and that's where partition came to be. Partition was supposed to create a Jewish and an Arab state, and as Anna explained, the Israelis took over what was to be the Jewish state plus half of what was to be the Arab state, and the Jordanians took the rest of the territory. So.
And Egypt got Gaza.
And Egypt took Gaza, right?
There was the second question also. Why try to change things when it's not as if our government cares about international law? Does anyone want to respond?
Well, I'm a very close personal friend of this radical man, so we've had this discussion many times. Yeah, the issue, I feel very strongly the issue is we need to change this government, and then we work on those other problems. Yeah, it's difficult for me to keep my spirits up concerning the Palestinian issue or work on the Palestinian issue because, the support by the United States of Israel and of the continued colonization of Palestine is never ending. I mean, we have nothing but presidential candidates right now who bow and kowtow to the Israel lobby, and so.
Can I?
Quick question. What is the citation for the article that Bill Christensen mentioned about 9/11? How can I access that article? What was that in?
Okay, you go to
You could send them to
globalresearch.ca, that stands for Canada.
Oh, no.
And
The author's name is David Ray Griffin, right?
find this article entitled, "Was America Attacked by Muslims on 9/11" by David Ray Griffin. It comes in 3 parts, and you have to download each part as a separate file.
My email address is on everyone's handout. If you email me, I'll get it from him and give you the details. I wanted to add, in terms of the question about change, one thing I wanted to add is some things people remind me of when I feel hopeless, and that is that hopelessness is a luxury. Palestinians really don't have that much choice on whether or not they're going to struggle to change things or not. Survival requires working for change. And so to remember that and be humbled by that us feeling like there's nothing we can do is really it's really pretty luxurious, and things do change, and they change by people committing to a cause, and if you ask people involved in previous struggles, anti-apartheid in South Africa, etc., they'll talk about how it seemed hopeless, but how things did change, and they're not perfect. But the universe, as Martin Luther King said, bends towards justice, and I believe it.
I would like to tell a little fast story that is an example of this. Last November, Kathy and I gave talks in Ramallah. Half of the audience roughly was internationals, half of the audience roughly was Palestinians.
Mostly Palestinian.
In my talk, I very pessimistic, and I emphasized what I thought was the fact that until we manage to develop a change in U.S. policies, the Palestinian situation was as close to hopeless as I could imagine anything being. I was immediately jumped on and criticized by several of the Palestinians in this audience who said, look, that is no way to talk to us. We don't feel hopeless. We're the ones who know in our hearts that we can do something if we simply get ourselves together. And at that point, in fact, even today, there's a fair amount of disunity among various Palestinian groups. But all we need, but if we get ourselves together, we are not hopeless, and we're going to continue going and marching ahead until we win this one ourselves.
Can I just add one more thing on this sort of topic? Yeah, as a general prescription, if you're looking for an infusement of hope or a lesson about the nature of hope, go to Palestine. It's probably been too long since I've been there, 2 years now, and time for me to go back and re-educate myself about what it means to maintain a sense of just unbridled hope and anticipation of a positive future in the most hopeless place on earth, really. So,
Person in the back?
So for Bill Stewart, what thoughts do you have? What would be the approach or strategy or tactics of an American president that would actually be helpful to get somewhere?
That's an easy one, huh? I think number one, to be much more actively engaged than this administration has been for 8 years. It is a disgrace that the Bush administration simply backed off the whole issue of Palestine and Israel. That said, curiously enough, it was George Bush who the first time said should be a two-state solution. Not that people didn't say that privately, but George Bush was the first American president who said that openly. I think the idea that you say, as people say, well, we can't force a solution. It has to be one that both sides come up with, and we might step in to resolve or indicate the way forward on one issue or another. I think that's wrong. The reason why we be involved is that we remain, whatever the criticism about the United States, we remain the biggest and most powerful country in the world. We're the only ones who can play an effective role, I think anyway, in the Middle East, regardless of errors in policy, regardless of anything else. Both the Israelis and the Palestinians know this. And I would say that it's up to the United States to say, very basely, given the amount of money we put into this and the number of people killed in this, that we have a right to say we think this is the way it has to be. And the way it has to be is basically agreed upon. It means going back to the 1967 frontiers, essentially. There might be variations on that. The destruction of the wall, the security fence. The question of the right of return is an extremely difficult one. It's very emotional. Most Palestinian refugees will not be allowed to go back to Israel proper, and they know this. The Palestinian Authority knows this, but you cannot take it off the table before you get there to say, in fact, that let's all agree to begin with that Palestinians can't go home. You can't do that. There is already something of an understanding amongst the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis that, all right, we might say something about maybe 10 or 20,000 go home. We might say something about it in principle, but in fact, this is not going to happen. And in fact, it isn't going to happen. We get down to a question of land. It's very basic. Who gets what and how? And that's what you really have to do. I mean, if we get involved in all the philosophy and all the rights and wrongs, as somebody once said, in the Middle East, there is no today or tomorrow. There's only yesterday replayed every day. And we had to get beyond that. and that there is a role for the U.S. to play, and a strong one. And this administration, the Bush administration, simply backed off, and I find that to be a disgrace.
I'd like to add something to that. I would beg to differ with your opinion on this. Frankly, well, we can think what we think will happen in the future, but there is no debate that Palestinians have the right to return. That is inscribed in international law. It's their human right. Now, Israel is preventing its implementation, and Israel may continue to prevent its implementation, but they will always have that right from international law. And really, you know, it's not the obstacle to them returning. It's not space. Most of those homes are covered with trees. They're not being inhabited. The obstacle is ideology. And so when human rights becomes more important than ethnocentric nationalism, there will be no obstacle. And for those of us, and this includes 10 million Palestinians who are working for a democratic solution, I don't think is compatible with the Jewish state. The right of return continues to be on the table and will be on the table as long as Palestinians want it there.
No, I didn't say, in fact, that there was not a human right and that there was no such thing as the right of return. There is the right of return.
Right.
What I'm saying is that as a practical matter, that's not going to happen.
And the other thing I wanted to say, and this is important, I'm sorry to take time here, but with regard to what kind of an American leader could affect change, I look at somebody like Obama, who used to speak out against what Israel is doing and who now is not because he wants support from pro-Zionist lobbies. We can look at that and say, oh, we need someone with backbone, right? That we can say that. We can say, Obama, you're being a wimp by not standing up. But Obama's doing what he believes is necessary to be in office. And so rather than interpreting it as Obama being a wimp, we could say, how can we create the circumstances where our leaders are accountable to what we believe and not accountable to what the pro-Zionist lobby believes? And that Zionist lobby, it's not bigger than us. I'm telling you, it's not that big. It doesn't have that much money. We could fundraise that much money. If you look at polls in this country on who supports and who doesn't support U.S. policy, we could be that big. We could be bigger. We could be stronger. We need organization. We don't lack people. I don't even think we lack money. We lack organization. And so it's not a time to throw up our arms and say, oh, I hope in the next 50 years there'll be somebody that's such and such. We need to create that reality. And the way I believe in doing that is one of the suggestions for taking action, and that is to join a campaign called 5 for Palestine, where basically all of our collective voices come together and actually function as one. It's actually based on the AIPAC model in terms of grassroots organizing all around the country, so that it's not just us doing our little thing here and there and hoping that people will come to their senses, but that we are organizing on a constituency basis in each small little part of this country, having offices, building that, and acting not as a bunch of individuals, but as one strong voice, because we are that strong. We just need to organize.
And say one thing. Hold it a sec. I need to say one thing. And that lobby, that Israel lobby, is an aging lobby. Its management is getting older and older. They are going to be weaker and weaker in years to come. There are a lot of possibilities for change there. There are a lot of possibilities, and I don't think for 1 minute, and I know there are polls out there saying this, that the majority of American Jews do not support the present policies of the Israel lobby, which is to push more wars.
That leads very well into the question that I was going to address to Anna. I grew up Jewish. I'm 58 years old. When I was a young boy and the state of Israel was in its early years, I was raised to be very proud and pleased about the existence of the state of Israel. I think that finally, and even through the '67 war, and perhaps even the Yom Kippur War in '73, that always continued. And then came the occupation of Lebanon in 1980, I believe. 82. Thank you. My question is, first of all, I would have to think that your family, your relatives, Anna, here in the States, Do they sit Shiva for you? Do they think that you are lost to the Jewish people? And is it possible that the majority of the Jews in the United States are at least moving in the direction of sympathy towards the Palestinian cause? Because if that is the case, I simply don't have any awareness of that. I would think much more so that the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community in the United States would shun your type of attitude.
So in terms of my family, I am very lucky. When I first started this work, my mother thought, oh my God, what have they done to my daughter? She's been completely brainwashed, etc. She thought I was totally naive. But she stood by me loyally just as my mother and read what I wrote. And I'm taking her to Palestine this winter, and with everything that she, with everything that she reads, she has started to understand. So I'm lucky that she was that open, and my father was open an even earlier time than that, but not when I started. In terms of Jews in general in this country moving in this direction, it is still true that the vast majority of American Jews identify as Zionist. I would say the vast majority of Americans, period, Jewish or not, have a default sort of pro-Zionist leaning, especially because of our media. I think a lot of those involved, let's say, in congregations. A lot of it is not so much that they themselves feel passionately, but sort of following the leaders of a lot of Jewish American organizations. Now, I believe that if Jewish Americans knew what was happening, there's a pretty good chance that a lot of them would feel differently. And so one thing to do is to try and approach those groups. I don't think they're the only ones that matter, or that they necessarily matter than other groups, other more natural allies, but it is something I'm trying to do. I gave my first presentation at a synagogue here in New Mexico in Albuquerque 3 nights ago. This is huge, you guys. I mean, I've never been invited into one. And yay New Mexico. I do believe that things are going in that direction. I believe it because I'm involved in a number of Jewish American anti-Zionist groups, anti-occupation groups. They are growing, and simply by the fact that sort of the truth cannot remain hidden forever. That Jewish Americans fundamentally, for most of them, this comes up against their values. And so as the truth comes out, as it inevitably will with Jimmy Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, with presentations like this one, that ultimately Jewish Americans will become part of the movement. That said, I don't think that they're going to lead it. And I think a mistake a lot of people make is by feeling like, well, if we can just convince Jews to understand, then everything will work out. And I think that's really the opposite way we should be thinking. I think we should look to natural allies, the 90% of our population who, if they saw this, would get it and would join us or would agree with us. And so again, I believe Jewish Americans will become part of the movement eventually. I don't think they will necessarily lead it. I don't necessarily think that they should lead it. I think it should be led by Palestinians. This is a Palestinian struggle, and I'm privileged to follow that lead.
Hi, I really love your optimism, Anna. I'm Israeli, and my family, by the way, they wouldn't sit Shiva for me, but they would say that I'm absolutely an idiot. And I just want to say that as far as the question of the political question of the leader and what he should do to encourage this process, the problem is that there's a gap between what happens politically and what happens grassroots, what happens on the ground. And as we've seen, what you just brought with the pictures and what Joe is talking about, it's a whole different reality. People in Palestine are not talking anymore about 2 states. There are no more 2 states. It's all taken over by the checkpoints and by Israeli occupation every place. The only thing they're talking about is perhaps a 1-state solution.
Do you have a question?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Anna.
So you were saying that this is...
I'd like to just acknowledge what she said. Thank you for saying that. Go on.
So you're saying that this is a fight for the Palestinians, but they're up against a force that's being funded by the almighty tax dollar and has been for many years. Their cousins don't help them, and they're swimming in money. You know, Jordan is supporting this administration. So my question is to the gentleman that addressed Zionism. You know, I actually protested when AIPAC held their convention at the Washington, D.C. Convention Center, and we had Orthodox Jews that were there, and we had rabbis that were supporting us, and they were opposed to Economist, and they were saying, they accused the Zionists of being atheists. Could you please explain how it is that they are atheists? I don't understand.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Zionist says atheist.
Well, you said earlier that not all Zionists are Jews and not all Jews are
Right,
Zionists.
right.
Well, these rabbis were enlightening me about the Zionists.
Okay.
And they were telling me that they were atheists, that the Israeli state was actually not established because of Judaism, but because...
Well, in a sense, that's true. I mean, there is this, that's the distinction that Anna and I both have tried to make. Zionism and Judaism are two different things. So yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of atheist Zionists.
Yeah, the majority of the Israeli population is secular.
And
so probably many of the people who identify as Zionists.
As I understand it, 85% of the settler population is really not religious at all. It's not about, they're economic settlers. They're there because it was a cheap place to get a home.
There is also, there are several sects of Orthodox Judaism, not Zionism, that are very anti-Zionist because they consider it an abomination that Jews established a state before the Messiah came. And so I think that's probably what they mean about the people who did establish the state were atheists.
Maybe.
Thanks for protesting the...
Yeah.
I wonder,
that's encouraging.
directed to Anna, could you tell me your assessment of the leadership in Israel itself? The reason I'm asking this, I'm a distant relative of Yitzhak Rabin, who got the Oslo Agreement about. And there's a mythology that Barak was giving a generous offer, and they didn't accept it. And the idea being, that what do you do with people who don't give you that kind of a gift? What do you do? How do you deal with them? And more important than that, maybe, or equally important, we had a rabbi for human rights speak a month before we went to war in Iraq. And he said that several of the political movers and shakers in Israel would like to see us take out Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And a month later, we started on one of these three. So, how do you assess the courage and ability of Israeli political leadership? You have a multi-party system, which...
To affect our country, to affect...
Yes, and yes.
I don't know if I can give you a satisfactory answer to this. I have had the sense at times that, so I believe that much of our U.S. policy is driven by pro-Zionist special interest groups in Washington that I've talked about. Again, not Jewish lobby, lots of Jews disagree, lots of non-Jews in it. Anyway, pro-Zionist special interest groups. And it seems there have been times when those special interest groups were actually much more right-wing than the Israeli government itself. It seems that there have been times that they themselves have not worked necessarily in tandem. And so what's not clear to me is to what extent the Israeli government is driving those Zionist special interest groups. Certainly to some extent, and enough where it seems that these pro-Israeli groups end up controlling U.S. policy. There may be others here, especially, I know Kathy is an expert on the relations, especially in different administrations. They might be able to answer better.
Well, this book that Bill mentioned about the neocons is an example of the kinds of people in the United States, the neocons, many of whom are Jewish, not all, but all of whom are very Zionist, very pro-Zionist, who have not only influenced policy, but have in this administration made policy, not necessarily because they're directly influenced by Israel, although they are to a great extent, But they think they know, they think that there is an identity of interests between the United States and Israel, that there is no difference in U.S. and Israeli interests. And so they think they're doing what they're doing for the United States and also for Israel. Could you put that any more intelligently?
The neocons are still, the neoconservatives are still a very powerful policy influencing group in Washington. They may not be quite as strong as they were before things started to go terribly badly in Iraq, since they were so big in being behind that war. Nevertheless, they are still very powerful. And this book that I mentioned, I really urge people to talk about. It told me things about the fact that the Likud sort of started a lot of the thoughts that the neoconservatives then took over and made their own and carried even beyond in their ideas and their writings all through the 1970s and 1980s, carried these ideas even beyond where some right-wing Israeli politicians weren't willing to go. So it's a mixed bag, but this problem of who makes the policy in Israel is one that we all have to study more on.
And who makes
and
the policy
who
here?
makes the policies in the United States. And Anna is totally correct when she says we got to bring about change in U.S. politics. Let the Palestinians maybe worry more about the possibility of changing their own politics or changing Israeli politics. We can only succeed, and we are best equipped to do this, we the voters of the United States, to influence and change U.S. policies.
On The Power of Athag, and they were savage for
Yeah, but they have a bestseller. So,
Do they, is it a bestseller?
This is Mearsheimer and Walt, who wrote a book that has sold very well.
I'm really interested in, I hadn't heard that there was so much infighting going on now with the Palestinian leadership, and is there any idea that that's being driven by outside sources? Because the more fragmented they are, of course, the less powerful they're going to be. Has anybody looked at that or heard anything about it?
I can answer,
divide and
but
conquer?
I talk more than.
It's a divide and conquer thing, exactly. Much of it is because, and this sort of goes back to something Bill said and something Donna said, who didn't have a question and has now left, unfortunately. The two-state solution is basically dead in Palestine because the Israelis have taken so much territory. And because the United States is enabling them to do that, the United States has no intention of forcing Israel, at least this administration, of forcing Israel to give the Palestinians a real state. You know, the fourth of Anna's maps had little dots. That is the maximum that the Palestinians can expect from this current Israeli administration, in any likely future Israeli administration, and from this current U.S. administration, probably from a future one too. And as a result, the Palestinian Authority that is still negotiating with the Israelis seriously, I mean, it thinks seriously, and in the very forlorn hope of getting anything out of those negotiations, is increasingly being seen by its own Palestinian population as collaborators. Which is why when Bill says that the Palestinian Authority is willing to basically write off, I know you didn't put it quite this way, write off the right of return, and that it is not as a practical matter, it's never going to happen. If the Palestinian Authority ever makes an agreement with Israel that does write off the right of return and agrees that as a practical matter it's never going to happen, it will be overthrown and there will not be a stable peace settlement. Which is what Donna was saying up there. She said there's increasing talk in Palestine, among Palestinians, about a one-state solution and about the necessity. I mean, the Palestinians, we found this in November when Bill and I were there, Palestinians are increasingly aware of the danger that their rights to and that their right to return to their previous lands are consciously now being trying to be written off by the Israelis, and so there's that unrest, and then the Hamas, the real split in the Palestinian ranks between Hamas and Fatah, which is controlling the Palestinian Authority, is basically a U.S.-Israeli instigated split. Hamas was elected in democratic elections, and the United States and Israel didn't like it because they're too fundamentalist, and so they're forced out of the government. The Israelis have arrested most Hamas legislators, and they've been in jail for a year or more, and so on. So that's a divide and rule.
And Hamas was initially supported by Israel as a counter effect to Fatah. So it's it goes back to the very beginning that this is very much, I believe, in Israel's interest.
In the back.
Would a one-state solution involve Israel letting go of their singular identity and include Israel and Palestine and be democratic in that way?
Do you want to? You talked about this in the radio one.
Do you want to?
No, you go ahead.
So yes, that is the idea. The idea is you take the entire area that is under the control of one government, the Israeli government, and you remove the institutions of segregation and apartheid, and you give equal rights to everyone there. And this is a very radical idea for those who are clinging to the idea of a Jewish state, because if Israel actually gave rights to all the people it controls, it would lose its Jewish majority, but again, it opens up the door to democracy. And fundamentally, that is what it comes down to. You can like the idea of a Jewish state, but I don't believe you can have a Jewish state and democracy simultaneously.
Well, that's precisely why Ariel Sharon, a few years ago, in fact, came to the idea of getting a unilateral withdrawal from Gaza and talked about the need to withdraw from the West Bank, however it was done, mainly because he felt that the demographics were such that there were going to be more Arabs than Jews in both Israel proper and the occupied territories. And therefore, Israel would be confronted with a very unpalatable choice. If you don't encourage an independent Palestine, then you're going to have a case where you're going to have apartheid or a very undemocratic country in order to maintain Israel as a Jewish state. If you want to maintain Israel as a Jewish state, which is the whole purpose of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, then in fact Sharon came to the conclusion that there would have to be a withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, how much you withdraw, those are all the modalities of what you actually did. But there was no sort of idealism here. It was just a recognition of the practical fact of the matter would be, and many Palestinians recognize this, that in time, Arabs will outnumber Jews in Israel proper, which already has 20% of the population is Arab, and then in the West Bank and in Gaza. So what to do? And this is not people being nice to other people. It's a question of recognizing the political facts of life.
This, by the way, the things that Hamas is faulted for, not disarming, not recognizing past agreements, and not recognizing the right of Israel to exist, these are absolutely also the case with Israel. We simply never place those same conditions on Israel. Israel also doesn't disarm. Israel also does not recognize previous agreements, and Israel also absolutely does not recognize the right of Palestinians to be there too. So Hamas ideologically opposes the idea of an exclusively Jewish state, which in fact requires the removal of the non-Jews from the area. That is not the same as being against Jewish people, and they have explicitly said, for example, that they would be willing to compromise, they would be willing to negotiate a two-state solution, even though they do not believe that that is just. They would be willing to follow the will of the Palestinian population, and they are also very well known for providing services to Palestinians. So it's really no surprise that a group like Hamas has come into power.
Could I just add that I agree with everything Anna said. Hamas is it's very strong in its dedication to Islam, and it doesn't want a Jewish state and it doesn't want to compromise, but it is willing to compromise. And to say, you asked if it were totally recalcitrant. That assumes that we, who don't like Hamas's position, we the Americans, and the Israelis who don't like Hamas's position, have the right to set the discourse, to determine who is recalcitrant and who is compromising. I mean, as Anna said, we and the Israelis have put conditions on Hamas that nobody has put on Israel. Israel is not required to recognize the existence of any kind of Palestinian state, of any kind of Palestinian right to exist. Israel is not required to renounce violence. Israel is not required to live up to past agreements. And so I would like to argue with your use of the term recalcitrant. I think Israel is recalcitrant.
Hamas's position is closer to international law than Israel's, basically.
My question is about something that we don't talk very much about here. How can we expect Israel to come to the table and offer a peaceful solution when the United States gives Israel more money than any other country for military purposes? When Israel can defeat, without any question, any Arab country that takes action against it. What worries me too is that the liberals of Israel, who don't approve of this policy, are having their own exodus and getting out of this country. It's become harder and harder. And as long as we're going to pour so much billions of dollars into that country, what's the incentive for Israel not to use it to do what it wants, which, in my opinion, is to get rid of the entire Palestinian problem?
You have given your own answer. You have given your own answer. The problem is United States policy. We are the ultimate underlying factor that causes this thing to continue.
We give Israel total impunity, as you say. So.
Both parties are in favor of this. How the heck do you stop it?
Both, yeah, that's the trouble.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to go. Thank you so much for coming, and let's continue the conversation.
And we'll be in the back continuing this conversation, signing books, whatever.